Well, it's all been leading to this. Thank you all for sticking with me this month and enjoying my tribute to one of the greatest series in video game history. And now, it's time to close October out in style. All the awesome characters, kick-ass music, shitty bosses, and whatnot have all been building up to the climax of Castlevania Month. So what better way to unleash hell than by counting down my 10 favorite games in the entire franchise? By doing it on Halloween night, of course! Before we start, I'd like to stress that these are my favorite games, not the best. You could actually make a case for most of the games in the series, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. But enough talk! For the final time this month, it's game time! A lot of Castlevania fans will favor the 2D games over the 3D ones, and I'll admit I fall slightly into that camp. But that's not to say that the 3D Vanias were bad or anything, just look at Curse of Darkness! True, the level design isn't absolutely the most stellar, and the soundtrack is hit or miss in places, but I still find the game to be a lot of fun. Hector was actually a decent protagonist. Granted, he was originally motivated by revenge against fellow Devil Forge Master Isaac, but he received a good amount of character development by the end of the game. The concept of innocent devils was a good gameplay mechanic that integrated well with the story, and served as more than just another pointless gimmick. Dream Drop Distance could have taken a lesson or two from this system instead of forcing us to play Tamagotchi to get the abilities we needed. Combat was pretty fun as well, with plenty of weapons to wield in battle and some nice environments to explore. The game isn't without its problems. I mean, besides the aforementioned environments and soundtrack issues, the voice acting is pretty groan-worthy, but I still got a lot out of this game. Also, was it necessary to talk in Old English, even considering the era? Up next, we have the third of the DS games and the last fully featured Metroidvania in the main series. Order of Ecclesia was a bit of a step up in difficulty compared to the previous two outings on Nintendo's dual-screen portable. Part of the challenge factor of the game comes from managing your MP. Every attack in the game comes from the glyphs you collect throughout the game, meaning you can't simply spam your attacks or you'll run out of MP faster than the heavy runs out of money from firing his damn minigun. Many of the bosses are also fun to fight, and using the right combination of glyphs is key to success. The story is rather average, and while it picks up in the middle, it eventually comes back to Drac is back, go whack his crack. That being said, there's plenty of good things in this game. The levels are well designed, despite the environments going over the typical environments for a Castlevania game. The soundtrack is the kick-ass norm as well, especially with some of the boss themes, and the challenge is a welcome step up from the previous two games. So while Order of Ecclesia was the last game in the series on DS, at least it went on a high note. And you gotta admit, as bland as she is, Shinoa is kinda hot. Everyone has that one game that they know isn't especially good from a technical standpoint, or is panned by the general fanbase, but they can't help but love it in spite of its faults. A guilty pleasure, if you will. And as I've established in the past, that game for me is Castlevania Judgment. Okay, I admit, this game is flawed. The character design may seem somewhat off-putting to some. Some of the characters were botched in terms of their personalities. The items sometimes felt unnecessary, and the gameplay sometimes feels like button mashing. But even with how flawed this game is, I could forgive it because of how much fun I had with it. Despite having seemingly simple combat, I found it to be really enjoyable. Playing as many of the most famous characters in the franchise just felt so exciting. Not to mention, you could finally play out some dream matchups from the series. Simon vs. Alucard? Bring it on! The various modes also provide a lot of variety. Trust me, those Time Reaper masks remain my badge of honor to this day. So yeah, even with the things that Judgment got wrong, I still managed to enjoy the things it got right. And honestly, that's good enough for me. When I made my Castlevania bosses list, I claimed that many people considered Portrait of Ruin as the weakest of the DS Castlevania games. Well, apparently I'm not on the pulse of popular opinion because a lot of people actually like this game. And rightly so! Picking up where Bloodlines left off, Portrait of Ruin continues with John Morris's son, who's named Jonathan because raisins, along with his childhood friend and genius mage Charlotte, as they enter Dracula's castle during World War II, only to find that the vampire artist Bronner and his daughters have claimed squatters' rights. As if those exist in Europe. And apparently Bronner took lessons from Peach's castle, what with all the paintings that lead to the various worlds in the game. The teamwork between Jonathan and Charlotte really makes this game work. Unlike Julius Mode and Dawn of Sorrow, the levels are designed around the use of two characters. You'll either be getting up close and personal with Jonathan and his weapons, making use of Charlotte's powerful spells, or using the two of them together to solve puzzles and access new areas, not to mention activating screen-clearing techniques. The interaction between these two heroes also contributes to the story to a good extent. This is especially apparent when Charlotte is the only thing keeping Jonathan's head on his shoulders. Seriously, these two are just too precious. Yeah, I ship it! I ship it like FedEx! With Simon and pals hanging out with the plumbers for the early days, I can only imagine that the Sega faithful were aching to get their hands on the whip. So at some point along the line, Konami figured, hey, why not give the rodent fans a seat at the table? Now this is a full-course meal, people. Bloodlines was the Castlevania game that Sega fans deserved. The hard-hitting, balls-to-the-wall action that the series is known for, with visuals that push the Genesis to its limits. I mean, these visuals are 16-bit gold. And this was a game that was willing to take a few bold steps. For one thing, instead of simply restricting you to the area surrounding Dracula's castle, the adventure spread all over Europe during World War I. One moment you're in the sunken gardens of Greece, the next you're in a weapons factory in Germany. Second, you have two different ways of playing the game. Sure, you have your standard whip wielder John Morris, but let's be honest here. Most people who played through the game did it with Eric. I mean, when you have a spear that lets you jump to the top of the screen and nail enemies in your way, why would you go with the whip and its limits unless you wanted a challenge? That is, unless the limited continues don't give you challenge enough. That's probably the biggest problem I have with this game. The fact that passwords save the number of continues you have left. I mean, isn't the point of continues and passwords to help you get through the game? Whatever, the game's still good, okay? Baka. Compared to the first game, Simon's Quest felt like an experiment. There were things that worked, and as gamers who frequent YouTube may know, several things that didn't. And similar to how Super Mario 3 felt more like its original than its sequel, Castlevania followed the same pattern with its third entry, only better. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse took everything that made the original work and amplified it threefold. The classic whip-slinging gameplay returned, better than ever, in an adventure that takes you through Wallachia as you storm Dracula's castle. The addition of the additional characters added a lot to the gameplay. Do you team up with Grant to navigate levels with his wall crawling? Do you take Sypha with you and ravage enemies with her magical power? Or do you stick with Alucard and his vampire powers? Either way, prepare to be tested to your platforming limits. This game is hard. I mean, Nintendo hard. The level design is difficult and unforgiving, especially with the overabundance of stairs. Stairs are your worst enemy in this game. When you're on stairs, you're basically a sitting duck. That's honestly the reason that this game isn't any higher. While the difficulty is generally fair, there are those places that just feel cheap. On the other hand, there are plenty of challenging bosses, excellent music, and that classic Castlevania feel. Nostalgia, this game has. Plenty of it. Just don't forget that Help Me gives you 10 lives. You will need them. All of them. To be honest, I don't think a lot of people in the US remember the TurboGrafx-16, mainly due to a lack of notable titles on the system, and I'm guessing even fewer remember the CD attachment. But of the few memorable titles on the system, one of them was Castlevania Dracula X Rondo of Blood. The 2D Castlevanias fall into two main camps, stage-based ones like Bloodlines and Dracula's Curse, and exploration-based ones like Order of Ecclesia and Portrait of Ruin. The formerly Japan-exclusive Rondo of Blood felt like a transitionary title, bridging the gap between the two subgenres. Its stage design and challenge were in keeping with the titles that came before it, however, the sprite work and need for exploration would go on to influence those titles that would follow. Some of the stages had alternate paths which allowed you to fight different bosses and access new stages in the bargain. Also, in Richter's search for his beloved Annette, you could also unlock another character, Annette's little sister, Maria. So you could either go through the adventure as your standard issue Belmont, or you could do it as a little girl in a frilly pink dress who attacks with doves and cats and whatnot. I'm guessing someone at Konami was a fan of magical girl anime. While the Super NES Dracula X gets overhated, it's nowhere near as good as the original. America's had to wait 10 years for this game, but man oh man was it worth it. As many fans of the series know by now, Symphony of the Night is one of, if not the most popular game in the series, topping nearly every list of Castlevania games out there. But even though it has definitely earned its popularity, it has come at the expense of a couple more deserving titles, which is pretty much the only reason I find it a bit overrated. Everything else I have to say is pretty much sugar and rainbows, or perhaps more appropriately, blood and badassery. There is no denying this title was a game changer. While previous games were stage-based, Symphony of the Night opted for an exploration-based platformer with RPG elements. While it can be argued that Simon's Quest did this kind of thing first, Soten did it right. With plenty of rooms of the castle to explore, upgrades to collect, familiars to aid you, powers to wield, and bosses to fight, not to mention tons of enemies to level up with. Another thing I appreciate with Symphony is what it did for Alucard. While Dracula's Curse introduced the Dampier, Soten established him as a total badass. I do, however, have a few nitpicks. For one, there are several overpowered weapons in the game that can make it a breeze. Seriously, do you see this ponage? Second, the upside-down castle felt a little bit tacked on. And lastly, while the music is kick-ass, I can't say the same about the voice acting.
Die, monster. You don't belong in this world.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
But one thing cannot be denied. This is the game that put the Vania in Metroidvania. I could totally see Alucard hanging out at the bar with Samus talking about mothers and babies and whatnot. Do your thing, fanfic writers! You wanna know just how super the Super Nintendo was? Home to arguably some of the best games in the history of history, it pretty much breathed new life into several franchises that started on its 8-bit daddy. Look at what it did to Mario, Metroid, Mega Man, and yeah, you know exactly where I'm going. Super Castlevania IV did exactly what it meant to do. Bring the classic formula up to date for a brand new generation. And my god, it worked wonders. The sprite work is wonderful, especially for an early SNES title. The use of Mode 7 made for some very impressive visual moments. The music runs the gamut from heroic and inspiring to intense and atmospheric. But what makes this game stand out for me is just how much the gameplay improved over the original trilogy. Simon is just so much easier and more satisfying to control. You can actually control yourself in midair instead of signing a fucking contract with your jump arc. This means a severe decrease in cheap deaths due to misjudged jumps. Also, the whip is so versatile in this game. The ability to whip in any direction is a godsend in so many situations. You have no idea just how much fun it is to wield a vampire killer to whip your way through everything or swing across gaps unless you've played the game yourself. Especially when taking on bosses like when I did that Let's Boss play a couple years back. At the same time, it maintains a level of challenge befitting the classic series. This is one of the quintessential games in the Super Nintendo library, a game whose true beauty can only be truly appreciated by those who have played it. So, what beat these two classics? I'll tell you after these honorable mentions. Circle of the Moon, an underrated GBA gem. Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth, a great remake of a bad game. The original Castlevania, the one that started it all. Lament of Innocence, the story of the beginning of the Belmonts. And finally, Dawn of Sorrow, a good game held back somewhat by some tacked-on stylus gimmicks. After Symphony of the Night, most of the Metroidvania games made their place on Nintendo handhelds. I've already brought up two of them on the DS, but what about the Game Boy Advance? Well, Circle of the Moon was pretty damn good, Harmony of Dissonance was a letdown, but neither of them can even compete with Aria of Sorrow. Alright, if you know me well enough, you may have seen this coming. I know I've said that Aria of Sorrow is my favorite Castlevania game before, but now it's time I told you all the reasons why. I mean, there has to be a reason it managed to beat out two series favorites for the gold medal, right? Dude, and how? Okay, let's get the bad out of the way right now. The game can be a bit on the easy side, and save for a few tracks, the soundtrack isn't the most memorable, which may be partly due to the GBA's limitations. So for the good, pretty much everything else. I really like the art style in this game, not only for the character portraits, but for the sprite work as well, which was definitely a step up from Harmony of Dissonance. The level design is really well done, and takes advantage of your progression through the game. As for the gameplay, it has my favorite hook in the series. The ability to claim the souls and powers of your enemies gives you so many possibilities for combat. Want traditional abilities? Sure thing. Want to wield elemental magic? Go for it. Want to summon freaking demons? Soma, you are the demons. But my favorite thing about Aria of Sorrow is that it has my favorite story in the series. Most of the other games boil down to Dracula causing mayhem and your hero of the day playing Ghostbuster. But this game's plot deals not only with Dracula and his castle, but also with Soma's struggle against a destiny I've spoiled several times by now. The characters are all well written and vital to the plot. There are no useless characters in this castle. Look, you can have your Soten, you can have your Super, but give me Aria of Sorrow and you won't hear me complain even once. I'm the Quarter Guy. Thank you all for joining me for Castlevania Month, and now the wait begins for Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like. If you have something to say, leave your comments below. I really appreciate them. If you want to see more, click the annotations for my playlists, and click that little subscribe button down there. I'm also on social media, and if you have some extra money and want to support the channel, you can donate to my Patreon. Trust me, I'll make it worth your while. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.